To begin with, I'd just like to say thank you to Professor Michael Peters and Tina Beasley, the Centre for Global Studies in Education and Waikato University for putting on this conference and giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. It's really heartening actually for those of us at a different coalface from many of you to hear the connect that education is part of the collaboration that's required. And I guess appreciate the opportunity to give the teacher's worldview, a teacher's worldview about the part that we believe we play in supporting our most vulnerable children. What I'm going to speak about today is a paper that went to the PPTA conference last week. The paper, Equipping Schools to Fight Poverty, a Community Hub Approach, was adopted by the PPTA. It was read and agreed on by teachers from around the country and that has now been accepted as policy, meaning I can come and promote it to you now. But first, I'll give some background to the paper and try and link it to the wider themes of this conference. Places the blame for educational underachievement by poor or minority learners squarely at the feet of their teachers. Minister Parata's statement that too many of the kids falling behind because they're not getting the quality teaching and leadership that all the evidence tells us makes the difference are Māori and Pasifika learners, those who come from low socioeconomic homes or have special needs. Also falls into this category. She claims that the reason for the achievement gap between these groups and the rest of the population is the quality of the teaching that they receive, a less elegant rephrasing of George Bush, it seems. PPTA utterly disagrees with this analysis of the problem, but in saying this analysis is wrong, I'm definitely not advancing a hopeless determinism in which schools simply keeps children in the same places in society as their parents and teaching makes no difference. In certain settings, such as I presume many of those the talks in the workshop at this conference are covering, it's uncontroversial, indeed considered normal, to assert that family background, including parents' incomes, is the largest factor influencing educational outcomes. Even Treasury acknowledge it, grudgingly I suspect, and this graph, point in the right direction, from Helen Ladd's paper, Education and Poverty, Confronting the Evidence, shows it all too clearly. Across 14 countries, the link between family socioeconomic status and reading skills in the PISA test is persistent. And this one from the Salvation Army shows the same thing here in New Zealand, with decile of school and MCA level 1 attainment. In primary healthcare, the term that seems to have equivalence to this is the environmental determinants of health. For example, exposure to damp, cold environment predisposes a child to rheumatic fever. If you switch this to education and take a child exposed to drug abuse, violence and familial crisis and say this predisposes them to educational difficulties, some will say that you're making excuses for teachers' low expectations. Recognising context and acknowledging its influence is not the same as saying it's inescapable. Teachers do what they do to overcome these challenges, to make a difference for these kids. It's the moral purpose that is at the heart of my profession. Helen Ladd, in the paper Education and Poverty, Confronting the Evidence, proposes a range of possibilities. Possible responses for policymakers to this persistent link, and I think they're worth exploring. One is to directly address the context by reducing the incidence of poverty in society overall, something that I'd suggest should be a fundamental aim of all governments, but one that goes well out of the realm of my professional expertise. Another is to deny the correlation and demand that schools overcome the achievement gap. And an argument often advanced for this is that some schools appear to do it, so why shouldn't all? Don't you just love it? You know, the kid from the ghetto who goes on to become a millionaire, the student from the class of 40 who goes on to become the Minister of Education. These stories are newsworthy because they are very much the exception. Ladd writes about this argument, that believing that one can simply extrapolate from these few success stories to the